All right, we're moving into the settlement of New England. Now, we just covered Chesapeake, and remember that was a turning point with 1607 with the founding of Jamestown and eventually the development of the tobacco as the cash crop. Also, keep in mind that Chesapeake includes Virginia and Maryland, and technically it's also part of the southern colonies. We just handle it differently because of that significant turning point. We just go into a lot more detail in that region for those reasons, I should say. Now, you're probably going to be more familiar with this region because you've been learning about them since elementary school. But first, we have to explore what made the Pilgrims board the Mayflower in the first place. And so we're going to go back to the Protestant Reformation. This is really a review from world history, or should be a review from world history. It all goes back to Martin Luther in what was it, 1517, when he attached his 95 Theses, his complaints essentially, to the door of the Catholic Church. At the time, if you were Christian, you were a Catholic. Those were the only Christians that existed anywhere in the world. They were all Catholics, right? And so what Martin Luther does is he sets into motion this break from the Catholic Church, and he creates this Protestant movement. And so from this Protestant movement, eventually we get Baptists, and eventually we get Methodists, etc. You get all these religious denominations that spring up that all have their ties back to the Catholic Church. And so even though today we look at the Catholic Church, or society seems to look at the Catholic Church as being so different, and not necessarily the same as other Christians, they are the original Christians. All these other religious denominations broke away from the Catholic Church, or really they come from the break from the Catholic Church that started with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Now, one of the groups that emerges that's also Protestant is the Calvinist group, led by John Calvin, and he promoted this idea of Calvinism that said that humans are weak and wicked, that we are naturally bad people, and because of this, God has already determined who's going to go to heaven. There are people who are predestined. That's the key word there, predestined to go to heaven. And if God hasn't selected you, you're pretty much out of gas. And that's going to be a major principle that we see in the Puritans, or the Pilgrims, that come over to America. Now, also in the background of this, in the 1530s, Henry VIII breaks away from the Catholic Church. And this is specifically something that happens, obviously, in England. And this greatly impacts the future, right? And so what ends up happening is you have this guy, the king, who is devoutly Catholic, had actually studied theology pretty heavily, and it pained him to break away from the Catholic Church, but he needed to get a divorce, and so that's why he did it, and he creates the Church of England. Well, in creating the Church of England, fast forward some years, and there will be some people who say that the Church of England is corrupt, that the Church of England is too similar to the Catholic Church, which would make sense because Henry VIII was a devout Catholic. Now, because of this, the Puritans are going to want to purify the church. They're going to want to make some changes to the church, and that's what's going to kind of set this whole Mayflower voyage into motion. Now, a Puritan belief, one of their main beliefs is that only visible saints should be admitted to the church. They did not like having to, in the Church of England, they did not like having to kneel beside prostitutes and having to kneel beside homeless people who they believed weren't predestined to go to heaven. All right. They believed that if you were going to be a member of the church, you needed to be of a certain status. You need to be a visible saint. And they would also, because of these beliefs, they would be harassed by royalty and by authority figures such as King James. Okay. They're going to be harassed so much that eventually they're going to leave and go to Holland before they even come to America. Now, we have Pilgrims and we have Puritans. Keep in mind, the Pilgrims are in fact Puritans. What Puritans are, they want to purify the church. All right, they want to purify the Church of England. The Pilgrims are Puritans. The Pilgrims, though, are what we call separatist Puritans. And this is very important because later I'm going to talk about non-separatist Puritans. The Pilgrims are separatist Puritans that say they want to break away from England, and particularly they want to break away from the church completely, the Church of England completely. Okay? And so they are going to be the ones that board the Mayflower and found Plymouth Colony. There's going to be another group later that we explore that are non-separatists, meaning that they come to America, but they don't necessarily want to break away from the church completely. They just want to reform the church. Now, the voyage, like I said earlier, initially they go to Holland after they were forced out and harassed by the king. But they were concerned that their children were becoming too Dutchified. They thought that their children were kind of losing their English identity. And so they decided that they were going to board this ship known as the Mayflower. And they sailed for 65 days until they arrived in New England. Now, they were targeting the Virginia area. But they ended up a little bit kind of near the Cape Cod area and ended up settling in Plymouth. All right. Now, keep in mind that even though they only want to kneel in the church anyway, they only want to kneel next to visible saints, half of the people that were on, or more than half of the people that were on this ship were not separatists at all, right? Some of them were just kind of everyday people. And so that's going to lead to some conflicts once the colony has been established. Now, the Mayflower Compact is incredibly important in terms of how we developed as a political society in America. This was signed on the ship, and this is signed because the Puritans recognize that they are in the minority, right? That most of the people on this ship are not Puritan separatists. And so they have people sign this agreement. And what this agreement says is that the people on the ship are going to subordinate their rights. They're going to give up some of their rights so that they can follow the laws that are passed by the government. Well, the government is going to be a religious government. The Puritans are going to take the lead on that. The Pilgrims are going to take the lead on this, and they're going to establish a religious government. And so what they're really doing is they're kind of creating the foundation for their power and creating the foundation for their theocracy. Now, this is important because this lays the groundwork for the U.S. Constitution. In principle, this idea that people are going to subordinate their rights and obey and follow the rules that are established by government for the purpose of having order, for having a stable society. All right. Eventually, in the future, in around 1691, Plymouth Colony will merge with Massachusetts Bay Colony, and I'll talk a little bit about Massachusetts Bay Colony in a bit. Covenant theology. Now, talking specifically about their religious beliefs, Puritans believed in this covenant of grace. The covenant, for those of you who are of religious background or who study religion out of hobby, covenant is a promise, right? And so the Puritans believed, just like there was a covenant between God and Adam and God and Abraham, they believed that there was a covenant between God and the Puritan communities, right? And that if you are part of this community and if you live as a visible saint, you have attained grace. And so they are essentially God's chosen people from their perspective. Now, they also believed and practiced this idea of the social covenant, this promise and this accountability to each other, right? And so this is a social covenant between people that are in Puritan communities, that they are going to be watchful of each other. They'll look out for each other. They're going to be on the lookout for any deviant behavior or anyone that might have some kind of disorder or anything that kind of seems out of the norm. Now, what they would consider deviant wouldn't necessarily be deviant in today's society, or at least in our American society. So, for example, deviant behavior would be dancing, or it would be kissing, or something like that. And so because of that, they kind of created these really strict religious societies. And again, remember, they're creating these laws and people have to follow them, whether they were separatist Puritans or not, because they signed that contract. So you either follow these laws or you can be banished or punished in some way, because remember, they signed the Mayflower Compact. At the bottom of the screen here, I have Halfway Covenant listed. You can't really see it, but Halfway Covenant was simply an idea that was developed in 1662 when it really takes off, and that was to kind of increase church membership because they noticed that church membership was dwindling and a lot of people simply weren't as religious, and so they started to allow people who weren't necessarily visible saints and hadn't necessarily attained grace in their opinion to still come into the church and be at least partial members. And so that's where they get the idea of the halfway covenant, that you haven't attained full grace, but you're halfway there. Now, moving into another Puritan colony, this one is founded by John Winthrop, and in 1629 he and other non-separatists receive a charter to come to the New World, to come to America. And again, they are non-separatists. They simply want to reform the church. They want to have church reforms. They don't want to completely break away from the church, and that's going to be different from the Pilgrims who found Plymouth Colony. All right, John Winthrop is going to establish Massachusetts Bay Colony. He will be governor for many years. He'll be very, very successful as governor, and Massachusetts Bay will be a very thriving community. Now, in Massachusetts Bay, again, they are Congregationalists, and the Congregationalists are simply a group of non-separatists who want to reform the church. They believe that there are some issues with the church, some issues with corruption. There are too many Catholic rituals that are part of the church, but they think that these things can be fixed with reform instead of just simply breaking away from the church like the separatists did. Now, John Winthrop will be a part of this Great Migration. There are 3 Great Migrations in American history. This is the first one. And this is the only one that has religious ties. But this is a Great Migration of Puritans. Again, they're Puritans because they want to purify the church. They're coming from England over to the Americas, and they're going to settle in the New England area, whether that is Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay. Most of the people that come during the Great Migration, though, will settle in the Massachusetts Bay area, and eventually Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay will become one. Now, this colony, they were strict Calvinists. Remember, Calvinists were those people that believed that humans were weak and wicked, and they believed in predestination. So even though they're not necessarily wanting to separate from the church, they are still very strictly religious. And so they have a lot of the same laws that were established in the Plymouth colony before them. All right. So, things like dancing and stuff like that, that could still be seen as deviant behavior. And so what John Winthrop says, and you'll read this in your primary sources, John Winthrop says, "We shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Again, the goal is not to leave the church for good. The goal is to show the church that they can be a city upon a hill, that they can be the model of what the church should be and what the world should try to replicate. And this quote, this city upon a hill idea, is so incredibly crucial to our understanding of privilege, our understanding of expansion, etc. This idea that we have this godly right to serve as a model for other people, as if it is our duty or whatever you want to call it. All right. And that's going to kind of feed into these other ideas of expansion, eventually manifest destiny, which we'll cover in a couple months, and later on imperialism, which we'll cover in the future as well. Now, what was life like in the settlement in New England, particularly in Massachusetts Bay? Franchise was extended to all freemen. So if you were a religious person, if you were someone who was of religious esteem, you had the right to vote. All right. Adult males who belonged to that congregation who did not have any debt. If you had debt, that was considered a sin. That was considered some kind of a stain on your character. All right. And so when we say people that are, visible saints or people who have achieved a certain level of grace, that was represented by not having debt, not exhibiting any deviant behavior and things like that. John Winthrop believed that democracy was the meanest and worst form of government. All right. He did not like the idea that the people would be able to have a say in their rulers. And so he promoted theocracy. And so Massachusetts Bay will be a theocratic society, meaning it will be governed by religious laws. And an example of that would be that there would be a fine for kissing in public. All right. You would keep those types of behaviors indoors if you were doing them at all. Here you can see a map of the New England area and how it was settled in the different years in which it was settled. Again, a lot of this is going to be a result of that Great Migration, where many pilgrims, or many Puritans, I should say, are coming over from England, and they're occupying these various villages and these various settlements. You can see where Plymouth is. See if you can locate Plymouth, which is just south of Duxbury, and its relation to other more prominent settlements. You know, you see Salem. Salem is going to be incredibly significant. Salem's up north, incredibly significant in 1692. Oh, sorry about that. Next up, the characteristics of general New England settlements. Very low mortality rate. They had very long life expectancy, especially for the time. They would typically live to about 70 years of age. So they lived very healthy lifestyles, and a lot of that could be attributed to their strictly religious principles and strictly religious rules and laws that they had to follow. There were many extended families, and so what we will notice is that people will come from England as a family, whereas in Chesapeake, most of the people that were coming from England, they were mostly men, young men, because of indentured servitude. Whereas in New England, or really in Chesapeake too, you know, the men would come on their own just trying to make some money. Whereas in New England, families were moving over to start a new life. All right, and so in addition to just the immediate family, right, that nuclear family, there will be extended families that come along as well. There were on average 6 children per family. Some families obviously had a lot more than that. And the average age when married, women would be around 22 years old, whereas men would be around 27 years old. Now, there were people who didn't necessarily fit into these societies, these New England societies. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Puritans are claiming that they're coming over for religious freedom, right? But they're not necessarily exhibiting religious freedom. They don't live by those principles, right? As a matter of fact, in New England, Catholics were not welcomed. And so that's why, one of the reasons why Maryland was so significant in that act of toleration, because that was a act that promoted religious freedom and religious tolerance for people who worshiped Christ, anyone who worshiped Christ. Now, there will be other people who are not necessarily welcome in the New England area, or who have issues with the hypocrisy, or what they see as hypocrisy of those people. Roger Williams will be one of those people. He really believed in religious acceptance and religious toleration. He vehemently he was very passionate about this idea of separation of church and state. All right. And so he vehemently opposed this idea of a theocracy. He believed that there should be a separation of church and state. He believed that the people should have a say in their government, and that religious laws should not govern a society, especially if you have people who are not of that religion, right? No one should be forced to follow laws of a particular religion that they do not necessarily prescribe to. He's going to end up being banished in 1635, and he goes on to found another colony, which becomes known as the Sewer, and that is Rhode Island. Rhode Island was known as the Sewer, and it will be kind of this place, this catch-all place of people who just can't fit in anywhere else, right? And people will say very terrible things about it. But the one thing about Rhode Island is that they absolutely promoted true religious acceptance and religious tolerance. And they were really the only colony that really promoted that without any hypocrisy. Now, on the flip side, there was also a woman who didn't necessarily fit in New England, and her name was Anne Hutchinson. She kind of threatened this patriarchal control. They did not like the idea of a woman being influential religiously or exhibiting any kind of power religiously. Is what they were opposed to. The Puritans were opposed to. And she believed that she had this direct revelation, right? That she believed that she had some kind of revelation from God, and she'd go around and she'd tell people about this revelation. Because she had this revelation, or she was telling people about this revelation, she was arrested. Some people had even suggested that she should be put to death, but she was ultimately banished in 1638, and she went on to move towards Rhode Island, and then she ended up being killed in New York, in the New York area, in an attack with some Native Americans, if I'm not mistaken. Now, some of the newer colonies, we've already established Plymouth Colony, right? 1620 Plymouth Colony, 1629 Massachusetts Bay. The other colonies that rose up, Rhode Island, again, that's known as the Seward, that was founded by Roger Williams, and their big thing is religious acceptance and religious tolerance, and they're going to do a great job at that. They will be the only colony that is not a hypocrite when it comes to religious views. All right. Pennsylvania will come very close to that. In 1634, Hartford, Connecticut is settled by Thomas Hooker, and the significance of that is, well, the main thing that you definitely need to know about the settlement of Connecticut is that they signed the Fundamental Orders, or they came up with the Fundamental Orders, and what that is it's the first written constitution, and so it lays the groundwork for the U.S. Constitution, which will come many, many years later. All right, so the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut you absolutely need to know as the first written constitution, and the significance that that has in terms of what eventually becomes our U.S. Constitution after the American Revolution and after the Articles of Confederation. 1639, we get New Haven founded. Eventually that's going to merge with Connecticut. Notice now we see these, nowadays they're just different cities within Connecticut, whereas at the time they were different colonies completely. Maine will be absorbed by Massachusetts, and it will remain so for a while, and then eventually it'll break off from Massachusetts. New Hampshire will be a part of Massachusetts for a long period of time until it is separated as well.